There's two, so they're just
Not that I was admiring.
there's two, I guess. They're just control it.
Every time I start to do that, my wife just about halfway through, and the ugly face is like, shut it down. Hi there. Nice to meet you.
Yes, yes, we're right, yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. We will come to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Joint Economic Committee's hearing titled The Economic Toll of Gun Violence, How Our Nation Bears the Costs. I want to thank each of our distinguished witnesses for sharing their expertise today, and I'd now like to turn to my opening statement. It's abundantly clear that the United States is facing a gun violence crisis that is unique in its deadliness and its scale. While mass shootings capture international attention, the use of guns in homicides, suicides, and accidental shootings impose widespread and long-lasting costs. Loss or energy to gun violence is immeasurable, but the economy-wide harms are real and calculable. According to new estimates from Everytown for Gun Safety, gun violence costs our economy more than $500 billion every year. This is a staggering figure, one that is both gut-wrenching and entirely avoidable. To put it in context, at more than $500 billion, gun violence costs our economy more than the national GDP of nearly 90% of the countries in the world. From healthcare to education, business development to housing, the toll of gun violence is borne by survivors, their families, and our entire economy. Each year, gun violence costs survivors and their families more than $1 billion in just initial healthcare costs, hospital care. It contributes to worse mental health outcomes, including higher rates of diagnosed psychiatric disorders in both survivors and their families. For children exposed to a fatal school shooting in their local area, antidepressant use increases significantly for years following an incident. Gun violence burdens our broader health system, stretching its capacity and taxing our frontline healthcare workers. And because treatment for firearm injuries costs more than double that of other types of hospital care, this epidemic further stretches our public insurance programs. Gun violence has also been shown to negatively impact the educational and life outcomes of children, particularly in instances of school shootings. Students that experience these incidents experience more frequent school absences and have a greater chance of repeating a grade, and they are less likely to graduate from high school or attend college. Gun violence reduces new business development and directly hurts job growth. Areas that experience gun violence are more likely to see businesses scale back and fewer new businesses form. Research has shown that one additional gun homicide in a neighborhood results in 80 fewer jobs the following year. Just gunshots being fired, even if there are no injuries, reduces home values. And because home ownership is the primary way to build wealth in this country, this has the power to reduce economic opportunities for generations. Tragically, we know that the economic toll of gun violence is rising. As firearm deaths, gun injuries, and mass shootings have increased in recent years, the gun industry has made money hand over fist. During the worst of the pandemic, gun sales spiked, leading to record high profits for the top two gun makers. As sales have surged, so too has gun violence. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives documented a connection between pandemic gun sales and increased violence. It found that guns sold in 2020 were more likely to wind up at a crime scene within a year of purchase than in any previous period. And like a storm creating its own weather, increased gun violence spurs a corresponding increase in gun sales. For example, it's a well-documented trend that gun sales rise after mass shootings. Investors also anticipate this effect, which drives up the share prices of gun and ammunition companies. For example, shares of the two largest gun companies rose more than the market average in the immediate aftermath of the massacres in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, San Bernardino, California, and Parkland, Florida. This self-perpetuating cycle is not an accident. After gun purchases plateaued in the early 2000s, the gun industry took action to revive sales, lobbying for the successful passage of legislation that granted gun manufacturers and sellers immunity from legal accountability for the harms caused by their product. The immunity provided by the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act is markedly different from the treatment of nearly all other industries. While other industries can be held accountable for products or practices that result in harm to consumers, gun manufacturers cannot. For example, tobacco companies were famously held accountable for the harms caused by smoking, which led directly to changes in the way tobacco products are marketed and sold. Protection from accountability has facilitated the launch of a new and booming market for increasingly lethal weapons. In the past, gun companies focused their marketing efforts almost exclusively on the sale of guns for hunting and recreational shooting purposes. Yet their marketing tactics have shifted in recent years. Manufacturers now push guns for personal protection, self-defense, and concealed carry. This has created a new civilian market for products that had previously been seen exclusively as weapons of war. The firearm industry has met the growing demand by flooding the market with more lethal weapons. The human toll of gun violence is unbearable, but so too is the economic one. Today, the United States will spend $49.3 million, today, $49 million, on just the medical care, first responders, ambulances, police, and criminal justice services related to gun violence, and $49 million tomorrow. We will pay this price tomorrow, the next day, and every day thereafter until we as a nation decide to address this epidemic. Last month, for the first time in nearly 30 years, Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, took action to curb violence, gun violence. This is an important step, but more is needed. To address the growing violence and its significant costs, we must work together to pave a more peaceful path forward. I would also like to submit our new report, The Economic Toll of Gun Violence, for the record. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Senator Lee for his opening statement, if he is here. Okay, the Senate is voting, so we will wait for Senator Lee's, but if I could turn it over to the ranking member, would you like an opening statement, sir?
Actually, I won't be as eloquent as Senator Lee, but he's in the middle of a vote. And Mr. Chairman, I have actually shared this with you. I fear often we are squandering decades of reputation of the Joint Economic Committee of being about the math. And the fact of the matter is, if we're going to lay out the math, we need to understand every possibility of what's the inputs. And if my brothers and sisters on the left, the input is firearm manufacturers, great. Vacuous, but great. Look, the fact of the matter is suicide rates, our homicide rates jumped 29% in 2020 alone. What was going on societally at that time? What happened societally? I'm going to show some charts here that when we adjust for suicide rates, there is a problem in our society, and the body's hunger to politicize it instead of distill the math, and then get to an honest solution that makes our society safer. And I don't know if the politicization of a once honorable committee that did the math is the path to get there. When it's my question time, I'll walk through the math and see if I can drive us to a place where we could actually work on policy that makes society safer instead of more political. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schweiker, and I too look towards that and would love to rebuff any thought that this committee is anything less than mathematically high integrity and honorable. And with that, let me now introduce our four distinguished witnesses. Ms. Sarah Bird Sharps is the Senior Director of Research at Everytown for Gun Safety Support Fund. Everytown is the largest gun violence prevention organization in the United States. Ms. Bird Sharp's research on gun violence is featured in multiple New York Times articles and other national publications. Ms. Bird Sharps previously served as the co-director of the Social Science Research Council's Measure of America, where she studied economic equity and social justice. She earned a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. Dr. Chethan Satya is the Associate Trauma Director and a pediatric trauma surgeon at Cohen Children's Medical Center. This is the largest level 1 trauma center in the state of New York, treating children from across the 5 boroughs of New York City, Westchester, and Long Island. Over the course of his career, Dr. Satya has treated gunshot victims in places like Toronto, Chicago, and now New York City. He's also an assistant professor at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra and serves as the director of Northwell Health's Center for Gun Violence Prevention. Dr. Satya completed med school and surgical residency at the University of Toronto and then attended Northwestern University for his pediatric surgery fellowship. Dr. Satya holds a master's degree in clinical epidemiology from the University of Toronto and completed a global public health program at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health in Toronto. Mr. Ryan Bussey is a proud outdoorsman, gun owner, and a former firearms executive who helped build one of the industry's most iconic gun companies. He has been nominated several times by industry peers for his prestigious Shooting Industry Person of the Year award, and has also served as an advisor for the United States Senate Sportsman Caucus. Mr. Bussey is the author of the book Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America, and now serves as a senior advisor at the Giffords Law Center to protect gun violence. Mr. Bussey resides in Montana. Ms. Amy Swearer is a legal fellow with the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, focusing her recent work on firearms and the Second Amendment. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, Ms. Swearer served as an associate at the Charles Koch Foundation. She's a graduate of the University of Nebraska, where she received her Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice and her Juris Doctor degree. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for being here. And we will begin with Ms. Sarah Bird Sharp, your testimony, and then we will continue. Ms. Sharp, you have the floor. Ms. Bird Sharps, can you make sure that that microphone is on, please?
I apologize. I thought it was.
Okay, thank you.
There we go. So my name is Sarah Bird Sharps. I'm the Senior Director of Research at Everytown for Gun Safety Support Fund. With tragic and numbing regularity, we hear of shootings on our streets, in grocery stores, schools, hospitals, and too many other places. Each day in the United States, roughly 300 people join the toll of those killed and injured with guns. Without a doubt, the human cost of gun violence is the people who are taken from us and survivors who are wounded is the most devastating. But examining the serious economic consequences of gun violence offers a wider lens for understanding just how extensive and expensive this crisis is. Our hope is that this research will help guide you and your colleagues as you weigh different actions to build safer communities. To garner this understanding, we worked with the leading U.S. health economist researching the cost of many types of injuries to analyze highly detailed federal and state data sets and extensive peer-reviewed research. We would like to submit the report and the methodology for the record. As Chairman Beyer just said, we found that the unrelenting epidemic of gun violence is costing our nation $557 billion a year, year after year. While not everyone directly experiences gun violence, we all pay an economic price for this epidemic. And the government share of these costs, paid for by taxpayers, is $12.6 billion every year. That's nearly 35 million tax dollars each day that could instead help pay for secure firearm storage education, community violence intervention programs, and other efforts proven to prevent this violence from occurring in the first place. This $557 billion estimate is conservative. It starts with the costs at the scene of a shooting, such as emergency care and police investigations. It continues to the longer-term physical and mental health care survivors need, lost earnings of those killed or disabled, and criminal justice costs. And it puts a dollar value on the pain and lost well-being of victims and their families. But it doesn't even begin to include the wider ripple effects on whole communities. If you talk to any superintendent, mayor, or even a pediatrician in a town that's experienced a shooting, they can produce a long list of costs that extend far beyond the narrow items we're counting. These include costs to address the trauma of children who don't want to go back to school, to neighborhood businesses and home values, and the larger reverberations on all of those who live in a community where gun violence happens. Using our conservative estimate, the annual cost for overall gun violence in the U.S. averages $1,700 for every resident. However, in states with stronger gun laws, the economic toll is less than half this amount. For example, Mississippi has long been challenged by high levels of gun homicide, suicide, and unintentional shootings. It has the weakest gun laws in the country. At an average cost of over $3,300 per resident each year, Mississippi has the second highest per resident cost of gun violence. This is a steep burden for Mississippians. On the other hand, Massachusetts has the lowest rate of gun deaths and some of the strongest gun laws in the nation. The average cost for Massachusetts is $503 per resident. This is the lowest outlay in the U.S., allowing Massachusetts and its residents far more dollars to invest in essential public goods like schools and workforce development and in building healthier, safer, more sustainable communities. Following each major shooting incident, some key in on mental health as a primary cause. Yet the U.S. is not an outlier in rates of mental illness compared to our peer nations. Where we are an outlier is in gun violence. Our gun death rate is 13 times higher than these other high-income countries. Our research shows we're spending precious funds on a preventable epidemic that brings nothing of benefit and plenty of heartbreak. We place ourselves at a severe economic disadvantage in the global economy with these enormous outlays. Thank you again, Chairman Beyer, Vice Chair Heinrich, and members of the committee for allowing me to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll now hear from Dr. Shasta.
Thank you. Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. It's a true honor. My name is Chetan Sathi. I'm a pediatric trauma surgeon, and I'm an NIH-funded firearm injury prevention researcher, and I work for Northwell Health, the largest health system in New York. I'm also fortunate to lead our Northwell Health Center for Gun Violence Prevention, which our CEO, Michael Dowling, launched 3 years ago to help energize the healthcare sector around this public health crisis. Throughout my career in Chicago and New York, I've had the unfortunate fate of treating multiple kids with bullet wounds and seeing firsthand the eyes of the inconsolable loved ones. This is not a political issue to me. This is not about the Second Amendment. It's very important to understand that this is about firearm safety for me and making our communities safer and saving our patients. In the last year, so in the last 6-7 months, we have seen more kids with bullet wounds at our children's hospital already than any other year total in our entire history. And I've seen kids who have pulled guns that were not stored safely in the household and accidentally shot their parents, their best friend. I've seen kids who have tried to commit suicide, and I've seen kids who were involved in gang-related firearm homicide. I've seen the whole spectrum just in the last month. You know, we recently had a kid 2 weeks ago who was walking down the street studying, got shot in the neck. She's now paralyzed. We see this day in and day out. There's a spectrum of gun violence when we talk about this issue, and we need to acknowledge that this affects each and every community in America, no matter where you live. It's important to also point out that the costs are borne most directly by victims and their families. As we begin this conversation about the financial costs of gun violence, it's really important to acknowledge that. My main message is that if we want to take a public health approach to address this crisis, we need more research and data. At the same time, there are tangible steps we can take based on the evidence we have. So my testimony is going to focus largely on the costs associated with providing medical care to victims of gun violence, and I hope that this will underscore the need to act. Let me begin very broadly with the big picture. Even without a fully funded effort to research the causes, efforts, and treatments for gun violence, a few things are clear. Gun violence is incredibly expensive. Treating firearm injuries is far more expensive than treating other injuries. And among our peers, only the American health system bears this level of cost. So first, with respect to direct hospital costs, as you mentioned, with the indirect costs, this epidemic is costing our country hundreds of billions of dollars. When it comes to initial medical care alone, we spend $1.1 billion per year on gun violence, and 84,000 patients come to hospital every year for this issue. The large bulk of that is paid for by public payer insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, and 20% of that comes from private insurers. Second, treating gunshot injuries is way more expensive than any other type of injury. Now, this is an important concept to understand. I invite any of you to come to the trauma bay to see what it's like to treat a child or an adult with a bullet wound versus a stab wound versus a car accident. It's just devastating. The amount of damage that one bullet causes, especially in a child whose organs are all next to each other, very close to one another, cannot be described, and you have to come and see it firsthand. For that reason, it is obvious that it is a more expensive injury than any other trauma that we see. There was a study in 1997 that actually showed that for gunshot wounds, on average, just the surgical costs amount to $154,000 per year and only $12,000 for a stab wound. Let that settle in. And when it comes to motor vehicle accidents, the cost to care for a child who has a firearm injury is 5 times that of a kid who comes in with a motor vehicle accident. So it's by far more expensive. And for inpatient stays in general, the cost is 3 times that of the inpatient stay for any other disease. And third, there's no comparison when it comes to our American counterparts, our peer nations. Of all other developed countries, our gun homicide rate is 25 times higher, our gun suicide rate is 8 times higher, and our unintentional firearm rate is 6 times higher. More than 80% of all firearm deaths happen in America when you look at the worldwide developed world. These statistics, of course, don't even touch on the hidden costs of gun violence with respect to victims and their long-term issues, law enforcement, neighborhoods, and the trauma to our society as a whole. I'd like to conclude by emphasizing that minimizing the economic burden that firearm injuries put on the health system is not enough. We must reduce the potential for firearm injuries in the future through more research, better care, and evidence-based policy changes. As you mentioned earlier, we shouldn't pretend to know what we don't, but we need the resources to be able to understand this further. There's no single solution. I'm confident that if we can build consensus based on our common mission to keep our children safe, make our communities safer, and together be responsible gun owners, that we can make a difference. I know we can prevent our fellow Americans from ending up on the operating table in the first place. Thank you.
Dr. Satya, thank you very much. Now recognize Mr. Bussey for his testimony.
Thank you to the members of the committee for inviting me here today. My name is Ryan Bussey. I grew up on a ranch where guns were an integral part of our lives. When we had time to have fun, it often involved guns. Hunting and shooting with my brother, my father, my friends. Guns were also tools for work and for protection. For me, firearms came to represent important parts of my culture, something quintessentially American. But I was also taught that responsibility and safety are required to maintain this freedom. My dad insisted on this every time we touched a gun. Today, I teach my own boys the same things. I got a job in the firearms industry after I graduated from college. I helped build a gun company, and I was nominated for the most prestigious industry awards. For the first part of my career, the industry insisted on the same responsibility that my dad had taught me. In fact, prior to the mid-2000s, the industry would not allow any tactical gear to be displayed in the main portions of industry trade shows because the industry knew that proliferating that sort of gear was dangerous in a complex democracy like ours. AR-15s and inexpensive pistols were outliers and represented only a very small fraction of gun sales. But by 2007, that self-imposed responsibility was almost gone, and everyone adhered to the same messaging, praising anything that sold more guns and attacking anything or anyone that might slow sales. Even after mass shootings, we were to cheer the hell no everyone knew would be the response to any proposal, no matter how modest. Everyone knew the debate around these proposals would create profitable sales booms, and nothing else mattered. The industry transformation was dramatic. Before 2007, gun sales never exceeded 8 million units in a single year, with almost no sales of AR-15s. By 2016, the industry was selling more than 16 million guns, and between January 1st, 2020 and January 7th, 2021, the industry sold more than 22 million guns. Most of those were handguns, and about 4 million were AR-15s. This represents a tripling of annual sales in less than 15 years. This expansion has produced huge increases in profits, with Smith & Wesson alone recently reporting an annual profit of more than $243 million. When people talk about our national challenges and what has changed in this country, no rational person can look past this monumental transformation in the gun market. This growth made fortunes for some. It also brought modernization to the gun industry. Inexpensive polymer-framed handguns became the primary focus for most gun companies. Business pressure sped investments that increased efficiencies, leading to much lower prices for what we call commodity handguns. These are the same guns that are now flooding into urban areas of our nation. These guns are cheap to make, many with hard costs of less than $100 each, but with average retails of more than $400. As profits increased, companies found more freedom to maneuver on price. When dips in the market happened, prices could be lowered to spur sales. Sometimes manufacturers even gave away guns to keep up volumes. It was not uncommon to see buy three, get one free offers that drove prices even lower. I saw this happen dozens, if not hundreds of times in my career. I never heard anyone question the proliferation of what low-cost guns might do to this country. Growth pressures from the industry also meant that dealers and sales practices that should have received far more scrutiny were excused in order to maintain volume. No one was supposed to slow down or ask questions because doing so would slow sales. This is why there has been such vehement opposition from the industry to confirming an ATF director. A good regulator will ask questions. I wrote a book about my time in the industry, about my battles to confront all this, about how our country has changed. The experiences that informed the book and my experiences since the book came out have taught me much that is important for this hearing today. First, balancing gun ownership with responsibility is absolutely central to the well-being of our democracy. I hear it from people across the country every day. Second, and very importantly for this committee, the feedback to my book proves to me that there are millions of gun owners who want to maintain their rights, but also want to be a part of the solution. They welcome reasonable policies that address the changed realities of guns and gun violence in America. They're tired of the loud extremists hogging the mic. Third, we need to move forward on policies like universal background checks and raising the minimum age of purchase on long guns to 21. The vast majority of gun owners agree. I am one of these gun owners. I am here today to represent the people who understand that we cannot exist in a country where rights are not balanced with responsibilities and regulation. We cannot continue to allow profits to outweigh the rights of all citizens in places like Uvalde and Buffalo and Highland Park and Chicago. I am here to say that I know much has changed over the past 15 years because I lived it, and it's high time we do some rebalancing to address these changes. Thank you for having me, and I welcome your questions.
Mr. Bussey, thank you very much. And now recognize Ms. Swearer for your testimony.
Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and distinguished members of Congress. My name is Amy Swearer, and I'm a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. A major focus of my scholarship is the Second Amendment and gun policy. I am not an economist, but it doesn't take an economist to tell you that gun violence has an enormous negative impact on the nation's economy. Of course it does. At the end of the day, though, what this committee wants isn't a debate over the total dollar amount we can attribute to gun violence. Instead, you want to know who's responsible for it, for those costs, and what Congress can do to save lives and lower the economic burden. In other words, this is fundamentally a gun policy hearing, just like the dozens of other gun policy hearings held on Capitol Hill in recent years. In that respect, my testimony should sound fairly familiar. The reality of gun violence, who causes it, and what to do about it hasn't changed just because we put an economic spin on the question. To summarize, lawful gun owners are largely not the ones at fault for gun violence or its costs. On the contrary, the protective economic value they provide is underacknowledged and underappreciated. The bulk of gun violence costs are due to criminal actions, which are most often committed by unlawful gun owners. Yes, a small minority of lawful gun owners will at some point use their legally purchased and possessed firearms to commit crimes, but the overwhelming majority of them will never harm themselves or others with their guns and will never add a single cent to the overall economic burden of gun violence. On the contrary, most violent crimes, including gun crimes, are committed by a small number of serial offenders who are often prohibited from possessing firearms, but who obtain them anyway through illegal or informal channels. It's not just that lawful gun owners aren't the problem or that they, as a class, are unfairly blamed for crimes they don't commit. It's that to whatever extent a few lawful gun owners may be responsible for gun violence and its economic costs, other lawful gun owners foot their bill and then some. The research is clear that Americans use their guns defensively far more often than many people realize, somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million times a year. And those defensive gun uses are not just about gun owners protecting their property. Often those lawful gun owners save lives, sometimes many lives. Consider the 22-year-old who just this week fatally shot a would-be mass shooter at an Indiana mall, one of 3 armed citizens who stopped active shooters in just the last 2 months without any injuries to themselves or others as a result of their defensive actions. This is not an uncommon outcome for defensive gun users. Based on the research and my experience with the Heritage Foundation's defensive gun use database, victims who use firearms to defend themselves or others from criminal actions are rarely injured. When they are injured, the majority of the time those injuries are relatively minor, especially compared to how serious they might otherwise have been. The chronology of those injuries is important. Most of the time, those injuries occur before the defensive gun use, meaning the defensive gun use stopped the victimization and limited the economic impact of crimes that were already in progress. Not only do lawful gun owners regularly thwart crimes, but there's a lot of evidence that every year a good number of criminals are deterred from committing a good number of crimes precisely because they're afraid victims might be armed. It turns out many criminals are rational actors who don't like it when people shoot back. Despite this, commonly proposed gun control policies nonetheless often assume that lawful gun owners comprise a bulk of the problem. And some of those policies are frankly just unconstitutional. At the same time, many of the policies that would be most effective at combating gun violence don't fit neatly into the current national narrative, but they would save lives and lessen the economic impact of gun violence. My written testimony is far more in-depth, and I hope you read it, but I'll highlight just one avenue that is particularly relevant for this committee. Gun violence is inextricably linked to social capital. That is, to all of the various elements of associational life, like our connections with our families, our jobs, communities, and civic institutions. Americans are often best served by government simply getting out of their way, especially when it comes to private voluntary associations. But from a federal policy perspective, one solution to the decline in social capital is to promote economic growth and employment, which increase family stability and individual connectedness through the workplace. And I hope we talk more during this hearing about how exactly to accomplish this. And I also hope we talk more about better enforcing existing laws, expanding access to and options for mental health treatment, and encouraging responsible gun ownership without preemptively hindering gun owners from defending themselves. Congressman, none of these are new solutions, but this isn't a new problem or even a new conversation about an old problem. The analysis is the same because the problem is the same. I hope the response is different, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Swearer, thank you very much. Now let me recognize the ranking member, the lead from the United States Senate, Senator Lee, for your opening statement.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for being here and agreeing to testify in front of this hearing. Violent crime is on the rise in communities all across our great country. Suicides and other deaths of despair are themselves at record highs. Homicides are climbing again, and meanwhile, police officers are retiring at unprecedented rates. Meanwhile, mass public shootings in Uvalde, Texas, and Highland Park, Illinois, have renewed the national conversation about how we can stop the evil perpetrated in these horrific events. Mass shooters who carry out highly visible acts of violence are fueled by an evil desire to inflict on others the extreme despair and isolation that they suffer themselves. It's our collective responsibility to understand why deadly violence is increasing and how best to address its root causes. Research from my staff on the Joint Economic Committee shows that most mass public shooters are suicidal, and they're less likely to have significant connections to family or to other people at work. They tend to live in communities where violence is concentrated and where their support systems have, for one reason or another, unraveled. Similar trends are true for the less talked about but more prevalent violence that's reflected in the 29% increase in the homicide rate in 2020 and the decades-long rise in suicide and other deaths of despair. These findings on the role of supportive families and communities suggest that the circumstances that lead to violence go far beyond the simple presence of a firearm. Nonetheless, every time a horrific event occurs, like the shootings in Uvalde and Highland Park, for example, we immediately hear demands from the same one-size-fits-all gun control mandates from Washington that many have pushed for many decades. And yet policies to stop violent crime must be faithful to the Constitution and must not inadvertently harm the very citizens we're trying to protect, especially those who are law-abiding. At its core, the Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, to defend one's family and community. My staff estimates that defensive gun use helped avoid more than $120 billion in crime last year alone. Limiting our fundamental rights under the Second Amendment makes us less secure, not more. Addressing our violence epidemic will not be achieved through top-down rules from Washington, but with the much harder work of reversing the decline in social capital in communities across America. We should look to community-led solutions focused on cultivating stable two-parent families, strengthening employment opportunities, boosting institutional trust, enforcing laws that are already on the books, and supporting local programs that help those at highest risk for violence. While far more daunting than proposals to simply restrict access to firearms, these solutions would be far more effective at preventing violence and providing support to struggling individuals in our communities. The decades-long decline in violent crime has ended. Deaths of despair are increasing, and mass public shootings continue to scar our communities. Understanding the causes of increased violence is more urgent than ever. I hope that our conversation today considers how we might alleviate the childhood trauma, isolation, lack of stable employment, and low levels of community trust that contribute to increased acts of violence. Family and civil society breakdown come with dangerous consequences. Confronting the underlying causes of violent crime must play a key role in our efforts to keep American communities safe and prosperous. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, thank you very much. Now we'll begin a round of questioning. Let me begin. Ms. Bird-Sharps, I am a very proud American, and I love the idea of American exceptionalism. You know, how we have been the source of innovation, the longest-lived democracy. We have so many Nobel Prize winners, we're the melting pot. But you also pointed out that our gun death rate's 13 times higher, our homicide rate 26 times higher than our peer high-income nations. Is there any connection, any possible connection between American exceptionalism and gun deaths with all the other things that we consider so wonderful about our country?
So often after shootings, people look for solutions, and sometimes people talk about, you know, it's a mental health problem, it's video games, it's whatever. And I would say that all of our peer nations in Europe, in Australia, in Japan, and Canada also have these video games and the same very similar challenges in mental health and rates of mental illness. What they don't have is more guns per citizens. And that is a huge challenge that we face. We're exceptional in many ways, many amazing ways, but that is a way in which we're exceptional that we really have to look into.
Let me just continue. Ms. Swear, I think, makes the very credible argument that the lawful gun owners are not the cause of the gun violence in America. At the same time, when we have 400 million guns in America, we look and say the homicide rate in Germany is 1/10 that what ours is. In UK, it's 1/40th of what ours is. Is there, let's avoid cause and effect. Is there at least a correlation between the number of guns we have and the homicide rates we have?
So let's remember that according to CDC data, 60% of gun deaths in a year are from suicide. Just under 40% is from homicide, and then there's 1% from mass shootings and 1% from unintentional shootings. So if you look at what's happening in the course of a year, 60% of those gun deaths are from suicide. And, you know, the lethality of guns is absolutely contributing to half of suicides in this country being with a gun.
Thank you. Dr. Sathya, you talk about, of the ones who've survived in a Harvard study, 71% were unintentional. Ms. Swear said 1% of the gun deaths were unintentional. But things like safe storage laws, improvements to firearm safety technology, universal screening would all make a difference. Why has it been impossible for Democrats and Republicans to find a middle ground on things like gun safety storage?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. I think at its core, I'll refer to what I said earlier in that this is a public health issue. You know, we treat kids and families from both sides of the political aisle. And at the end of the day, after we treat their children with bullet wounds, they all want the same thing. Gun owners are our biggest supporters in our efforts to approach this as a public health issue. Listen, we did it with tobacco use. We did it with motor vehicle collisions. We did it with HIV, stigmatized issues. We took a public health approach, we focused on safety, and we were able to transcend politics. It's important that we're using a lot of the words violence and mass shootings together. When we talk about gun violence, we're talking about firearm-related injury, and it could be homicide, suicide, or unintentional injury. And I agree with what everyone is saying. We should not confuse these as the same. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't act when we can. And each of these requires different interventions and solutions.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Bussey, again, Ms. Swear said a mind-blowing number of guns are stolen from lawful gun owners. My local police would say it's the first thing they look for when they break into a house, many from unattended vehicles. You come from the gun industry. We heard earlier that 3% of gun owners own half of all the guns. Why, with so many gun owners, so many NRA members, agreeing to common sense, middle ground, non-invasive gun safety measures, like locking up your guns, why has it been so hard to get a single Republican to find some way to move forward?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. It's my assessment, after having been inside the industry, that the very sort of hell no attitude that has propagated through the NRA and through the firearms industry. Hell no to universal background checks after Sandy Hook. Hell no to raising the minimum age of buying AR-15s to 21. That same attitude is wound throughout the DNA of the Republican Party and the GOP. And so these things that pull high, 82% on background checks and almost as high on raising the minimum age, when we go to attack those things as a society, we're not attacking this, the analogy I use is if it's a very small pebble laying on the ground, it looks like you ought to be able to pick it up and toss it over the fence. The problem is when you bend down to pick it up, it's attached to a much larger rock that is attached to a much larger mountain. And that rock and that mountain are the politics and the approach of the GOP that have the same hell no attitude to making these highly accepted, pull very high through gun owners. Instead of accepting those and doing the responsible thing, we say hell no to those too. So those simple policies that pull high are attached to something much more difficult.
Great. Thank you all very much. Let me now recognize the senator from Utah, Senator Lee, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Swear, I'd like to start with you, if that's all right. I am struck by the connection between suicides and mass shootings. They go together. In fact, more than 70% of mass shooters have some indication that they intend to commit suicide before or during the attack, or they're otherwise suicidal before carrying out the attack. This problem does appear to be bigger than guns. It certainly, mass shootings by definition involve guns, but it's a pretty narrow subset of, very narrow subset of those who have guns that carry out these particular types of attacks. And as we've seen with the rise of drug overdose deaths and resurgent violent crime, our country's in the midst of a crisis in which our culture appears to lack the once really robust support of families and other points of community contact, things amounting to what we refer to as social capital. So mass shootings, suicides, and violent crime are in many respects symptoms of these deeper problems. How can focusing on underlying causes, things like highlighting the importance of loving two-parent families, help us to prevent more tragedies?
Well, thank you for your question, Senator. It does so because when you address these underlying causes, one, you remove the problems of sort of going after the bulk of gun owners who are not part of this problem. But when you focus on the underlying causes, you're now dealing with issues of human flourishing generally. You are solving problems, or at least addressing problems, that are much broader than firearms. The stat has already been thrown out at least once today. Only half of suicides are committed with firearms. So even if you take away all firearms and assume that no one else kills themselves without firearms who otherwise would, you still have a very significant problem. It's the same thing with violence generally. It's the same thing with, as you mentioned, these mass shooters who are overwhelmingly suicidal and dealing with other deeper underlying issues. When you address those issues, you are now addressing those parts of humans that are not flourishing. You are making society better on the whole, and you're doing so in a way that doesn't go after people who are law-abiding, who are not ever going to be a danger to themselves or others. So on the whole, it's just a more economic and efficient way of dealing with societal problems, is getting at those root causes instead of trying to play whack-a-mole, going after things on the surface.
Right. If one could attach a value of 0 to gun ownership, and if one could somehow separate out constitutional protections and assume the ability of government to enforce to a 100% degree in a gun ban, one can imagine a world in which that sort of thing might proceed. But of course, we do have constitutional protections. And one of the reasons we have constitutional protections, dating back more than 2 centuries in our country, dating back many centuries more than that under the English Bill of Rights, is because they do have some utility. That's why the Constitution did make that compromise, that bargain, understanding that some people would misuse them, but there was some utility to it, and that Americans should be able to avail themselves of that right. Can you tell us something about the benefits that you see attached to gun ownership and defensive gun use? For example, what would be the dangers to the personal safety and self-defense interests that we have as citizens from undermining the constitutionally protected right to bear arms?
Senator, the Second Amendment, as I think you suggest, is premised on this right of self-defense, whether it's self-defense against tyrants or self-defense against criminals when the government can't or won't be there to protect you. In terms of what that means to the benefit of individual gun owners, again, a stat that has already been thrown out, there are 400 million firearms in this country. When you go after and restrict the abilities of lawful gun owners in a way that doesn't, especially when those ways don't also address the ways in which criminals are getting their firearms or disarming criminals, you have now essentially limited the ability of law-abiding Americans to fight back without going after the other segment of those 400 million firearms that are still going to be in the hands of people who are bent on criminal acts of violence. So if you think of it as like a scale with the costs and benefits of gun violence, you are removing the part that is beneficial while not doing anything to address the part that adds to the economic burden. So again, you want to make sure that any sort of gun policy is focused on those more narrow channels through which criminals are getting their firearms, through which criminal actions actually happen, without broadly restricting the rights and abilities of law-abiding Americans.
Thank you. I see my time's expired.
Thank you, Senator, very much. Now we recognize the distinguished gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Bokan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Let me start, Mr. Bussey. So you're an executive at a gun company, and when you hear all the numbers and you read about this, I mean, this is almost exclusively a United States problem, and yet I don't think we exclusively have that much more of a rate of suicide or anything else, and yet the gun deaths just stand out so significantly. Can you describe a little bit about the business model of the modern gun manufacturing industry? And specifically, I've got to imagine this is talked about at some point. In 2020, I think 3.6 million rifles were manufactured or imported in the United States, and only 100,000 were exported. I mean, this is a distinctly United States problem. Can you just talk about that marketing model?
Well, the marketing model has changed dramatically, again, in the past 15 years, really kicking off in 2007. Prior to that, the industry itself, as I noted earlier, would not allow any tactical gear, such as the gloves and hats and bulletproof vest, researched and worn by the Buffalo shooter, some of it by the Uvalde shooter. None of that was allowed even to be displayed or discussed or sold in the firearms industry in its own large trade show every year. That was a voluntary prohibition. It's not that it was illegal, it was voluntary. And it was voluntary because there were a group of responsible people who were in the industry then, who knew that, again, propagating those things throughout society and the marketing schemes that would follow to sell them could lead to very dangerous outcomes. And I think we're now living with those dangerous outcomes. Likewise, even during the assault weapons ban, which is much discussed, 1994 to 2004, September 13, 2004, it sunsetted. AR-15s were perfectly legal during that period. Most people don't understand that. Assault weapon was defined as a gun like an AR-15 with additional features on it. And so the industry during that 10 years could have sold hundreds of thousands, millions of AR-15s, and yet they did not. They did not because, again, there was a voluntary prohibition. It was relegated to the darker halls of the industry. Those things were not sold and marketed in any kind of numbers, more than about 50 to 100,000 a year versus about 4.5 million now. Again, it was voluntary. Much like our politics 15 or 18 years ago, there were lines of decency across which company executives knew not to step. We have now removed all of that, and the only thing that matters we have introduced essentially quarterly capitalism into our politics and into the gun market. The only thing that matters is winning the next election or making the next gun sale. The only thing. So any sort of voluntary prohibition about decency, about how we advertise, about selling guns to kids, about AR-15 manufacturers by the hundreds now, about tactical gear using sex and everything else to sell to very troubled young men, that's all gone. Is it illegal? No. Is it immoral? Absolutely.
And that was the second question I was asked specifically on AR-15, that huge increase in the sales. I'm from Wisconsin, and, everyone who runs for office puts multiple photos of the animals they've, killed that season to show, how tough they are.
I'm right there with them.
Yeah, I mean, it literally, everyone from every party, I mean, how many, deer you can have dead in your brochure tells you how you're going to do in the election cycle. But I don't know many people who actually use an AR-15. And yet I just went to Smith & Wesson AR-15, and it's like hunting they're selling it for. But it's really not that tradition. I understand when, the Constitution was written, people had muskets, so they didn't have to worry about the weapons that we have now. They never even would have imagined that. But could you just talk a little bit more about specifically the AR-15 and how it's being marketed?
When the AR-15 became both political symbol and tool to grow the industry again in 2007, 2008, the industry undertook very expensive marketing studies to try to ascertain how it could make the gun and the marketing of the gun more acceptable in the general public. And the marketing came back and said, we essentially need to apply sporting terminology to this because the general public approves of sporting terminology. I am one of those people who have the deer pictures with my kids. My family does. All of my friends do. That's a very accepted form of firearms ownership across much of the country, one that I enjoy very much. When the firearms industry undertook this marketing, it came back and the NRA and the National Shooting Sports Foundation said, we've settled on a name that will be acceptable to the general public. We're not going to call them assault rifles. That's verboten. We're not going to call them AR-15s. We're going to call them modern sporting rifles. And that is the terminology that is used today. They're called modern sporting rifles. Are there some that are used for hunting purposes? Yes, a tiny percentage. Most of them are not used for sporting. The gun that was used by Kyle Rittenhouse was a Smith & Wesson M&P Sport. The gun that was used in the Parkland shooting was a Smith & Wesson M&P Sport. I could go on and on and on. These are not sporting guns.
Okay, thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan. And we recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Swigert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, title of our hearing, economic toll. And I'm trying to get my head around, because I have an interesting interest on, I keep sitting here looking at the charts and data. Even the doctor actually said something that was sort of fascinating, of sort of the different categories he ends up dealing with. And I'm going to first do some charts. Ms. Swear, I'm going to actually ask some couple questions of you. But my goal here is not to figure out how many dead animals, though. That's actually, being from Scottsdale, that's actually, for us, a little creepy. But we have a lot. But we have a dozen indoor shooting ranges in my district, and some of them cost a fortune to become a member of. But I'm looking at the suicide data on the sheets broken out by states. And let me do this, just so I can sort of get my head. I'm one of those people that almost needs a prop. And I got to compliment, I believe much of this data is coming from Everytown, and it's been quite useful. They're easy to use. Our total firearm bad acts, suicides, homicides, and then we've been trying to set up an access here on restrictions in those states. Okay, good chart, good data. But then when we actually started to try to normalize saying suicides, particularly if I will normalize for functionally 5 southern states that actually have some very unusual, data on their, excuse me, if I normalize for suicides and I pull the suicides out, and then I come back and normalize for what I'm seeing, and I know I'm going a little geeky, but if I were to pull those 5 southern states out, my homicide rates are actually the distributionally, but pretty random out there. I mean, it's not like I'm seeing that the axis of here's states with firearm restrictions, and I'm then seeing a skewing saying those states have dramatically less bad acts other than suicide. It's not in the data. And that lets us sort of understand we got, in some ways, maybe a bigger problem than we understand. You know, how do you basically, if our goal here is a safer society, more prosperous society, less economic damage, am I looking at a world where I need to completely rethink our debate on firearms and firearm violence? Is it maybe we go back to the 1950s and we're having training in school? States like Arizona, 25 plus years ago, we legalized concealed carry, but we asked you to go through training. And there were predictions we would see substantially more bad acts, and that didn't happen in the data. Illinois, Florida, dramatically different restriction rules, both complex populations, substantially different, numbers in some of the bad acts with firearms. What could we do as a society to deal with the suicide numbers that just, if you look at these suicide numbers, they rip your heart out. I have an academic article, which is somewhat above my head, but I've been trying to read it, that's talking about and trying to analyze these young men who've been involved in mass shootings and how many of them have been displaying suicidal tendencies. I'm just, Ms. Swear, what am I thinking wrong? If this were, we were having a truly honest debate and we were whiteboarding this and saying our intention is to make society safer, what would we be breaking out? What would we be looking at?
I'm sorry, can you, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Am I wrong to be thinking that suicide prevention is where a bunch of capital goes? Training on knowing that how to use your firearm, how to keep it safe, that you don't grab a firearm and start cleaning it until you've gone through the proper procedures. I mean, those of us that grew up with this, we have rules. And how many young people are out there running around with a firearm that have no blanking idea how it works? I mean, if I were to come and say, here's a dozen things, what makes society, what are you seeing out there in literature that would make us safer?
Yeah, I think I understand the question a little bit better. I'm going to pull off of some of the things you've already mentioned. So you talked about mass shootings in particular and suicide prevention. I think you're correct. To a large extent, mass shooters are suicidal. And they're showing signs of being a danger to themselves or others. While mass shootings are considerably a small part of the problem, they have an outsized effect on both the sort of the national conversation and the way we feel about public safety. So it does matter. But what that tells us for prevention is that a lot of these individuals are showing signs of being a danger to themselves or others, that there are methods for targeted intervention or even just generalized suicide prevention that are more likely to lower those rates and to allow for intervention, other than just broad gun control measures.
And look, I know I spoke too long, and thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman, but there's also some fascinating discussion here on both the homicide rates, but also if we could understand, why does a state like Massachusetts have such a amazing number on, low number on suicides, but also some other states that actually have very open firearm laws also have terrific. It turns out there's complexity here, and if we're going to be intellectually honest, we need to bathe into that complexity. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stryker, very much. Let me introduce the winner of yesterday's primary in Maryland, the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Lee, thank you for holding this hearing today. We appreciate it very much. I'd like to start off with a question for our Ms. Swear, our Republican witness. And I've been a gun owner, shotguns, rifles, grew up on a farm, hunted all my life, taken gun safety courses, and certainly would be supportive of owning a firearm. Could you tell me how many times in America an AR-15 has been used in self-defense of someone's home?
Do I know the exact number? No.
Any number, you have it all.
I know that it happens. I would refer you
It
to
happens? Where's that number come from? Happens?
our defensive gun use database and my research and experience researching defensive gun uses. Though I would say, to a large extent, a lot of defensive gun uses happen in public, where people are generally not carrying around AR-15s. So you will probably see, and you should expect to see the same distribution in terms of types of firearms.
So we really don't
that you
see
can find.
anywhere ever where someone's using AR-15 to defend their home. That hasn't happened, has it really?
Yes.
Maybe
sir,
that guy
it
was a
has.
narco. Maybe he was a narco. Maybe he was
In fact,
fighting other
I can-
narcos, but.
No, sir, I can think of a time, actually within the last couple of weeks, from Largo, Florida, where an individual used an AK-47 to defend his home lawfully. He is not facing charges. The sheriff has said he is not facing charges against multiple intruders. So this does happen, and I think far more often than individuals realize.
We're gonna find out, and we've asked for a study to be made on that, because I don't think it happens too daggone often. And the AR-15 is for human hunting. That's what it's for, human hunting. And as Dr. Busey said, it's about
And why do law
sport
enforcement
rifles.
officers generally have them? Are they
Because
going around hunting
they're
humans?
law officers who are taking care of humans that are going down a wrong path.
So
thank
should
you.
I not-
I take my time back. We're all finished, you and I. Human hunting.
The IQ to read it. So.
Now, Mr. Busey, you spoke about working for a prominent, gun company and what's happened behind closed doors and financial gain and companies that did the right thing for many, many years, and then they said, hey, there's easy profit here, and we hit our quarterly numbers. Why don't you just give us a couple of quick steps that we should be doing here to help take back the industry from the lobbyists, et cetera, that are supporting the other party, as you talked about, who are just there not for protecting hunters, and certainly the idea of a constitutional protection that has no utility now in today's world. There's no utility of a constitutional protection for having a gun in your home. That's a zero, and that's a farce. So talk about exactly how we can hold the gun industry and those who stand to benefit from it accountable.
Appreciate the question, and like you, I grew up on the farm. I appreciate the guns I own. I want to keep owning them. I think things that we can do, people like you and I who grew up understand that guns are a very serious thing, very serious. We should not treat them, we should not regulate them as if they are cans of Coke or some other consumable thing in a grocery store. These things are much more serious. As my father taught me, as he handed me a gun, this can cause death in an instant. So we need to start regulating them as if they are serious. Over the last 15 or 18 years across much of the country, we have reduced regulations. We haven't increased them. And I know people tire of this example, but if you were to take the same population and triple the amount of cars on the highway, you would not reduce regulation to make society function better with triple the amount of cars. Yet something as serious as a gun, which I appreciate and own and want to continue to own, I consider my plea for responsible regulation to be the pro-gun position, because responsible gun owners who want to maintain their rights want to do these sorts of things to hold other gun owners and the industry accountable so that we can maintain those rights.
I feel the same way. I'm pro-gun. There's no question about it. But I'm not pro-gun human hunting guns. That's a different type of gun for a different mission. I'd like to ask, the legislation we've done recently on guns, which is really mental health legislation, and we're very pleased that happened, that's going to make major differences, I believe, in our mental health and our schools in particular. And Doctor, let's have Mr. Bird Sharp speak to this a quick second. What else we need to add to that to help us on the mental health in our schools, ma'am?
I think that's a huge, that the bipartisan act is tremendous, and support to schools is really important. I think that there's many other things that we need to do, including, more secure accountability for secure storage, so that, people can't get access to, that people are storing their guns securely, that we're having awareness campaigns so that everybody knows to secure their guns securely, and that gun owners are held accountable when, for instance, a child gets access to a gun. Those are, that's beyond the mental health realm, but that's incredibly important, particularly for young people in this country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Trone, thank you very much. Now let me move on to our distinguished gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today. Over the past 2 years, we've seen violence spiral out of control across the country, both in major metropolitan areas as well as along the southern border. This is a serious problem and must be addressed. But this rise in violent crime is not because of a sudden increase in firearms. For almost 30 years, crime rate was trending down while gun ownership was increasing. 2020 marks the recent rise in violence and homicides across the nation. I don't think it's a coincidence that this rise followed the repeated slogans like defund the police and open borders. Today, violent crime is up more than 40% from last year in New York City, and in LA, murders are on track to top a 15-year record. Defunding the police has been a disaster for Americans living in our largest cities. And a corresponding wave of drug-related crimes caused by open border policies from the Biden administration are making a bad problem much worse. In 2021, drug overdose deaths in the United States reached an all-time high, up 17% from the prior year. And fentanyl, which continues to pour across the border, is now the leading cause of death for Americans 18 to 45. We urgently need to address the underlying causes of violence. That starts with giving our law enforcement the proper respect they deserve for keeping the peace, and by making sure that violent criminals are sentenced properly by district attorneys. The recent attacks on police officers have been horrific. Over 141 officers shot, 27 of those being ambush-style attacks so far in 2022. It's no wonder why more than 2,100 cops have resigned or retired this year in New York City, over 500 of those occurring just in June. We can't reverse the past 2-year trend in shooting and homicides if we don't have any police. If we're going to have a real conversation about ways to reduce violence within our communities, we've got to include ending anti-cop hostility. It's time we get back to law and order in the country. We must prosecute violent criminals, and we must secure the border. Ms. Swear, in a hearing earlier this year before the Senate, you were cut off before while discussing some data about rogue prosecutors. What role do they have to play in reducing violent crime in Chicago and other cities that may have seen a spike in crime?
Thank you. Sorry, I think it does two things. So first of all, whenever you are not prosecuting crimes, when you're not ensuring that those small minority of individuals who are responsible for a majority of violent crime are incarcerated or meaningfully punished and are off the streets, they continue to be re-released. They continue to be out there facilitating a lot of these same violent crimes over and over again. And at the same time, when they are not being punished, it at the very least does not disincentivize them and often incentivizes them to commit violence because they understand that there's not going to be a serious punishment for those offenses. So it's problematic both from a very practical standpoint, but also from the theoretical standpoint of signaling to them that their offenses are not going to be taken seriously.
How do firearms help women protect themselves from violent attacks?
They, in many respects, equalize their ability against their assailants. So women, especially compared to male attackers, and I say this as a fairly athletic woman myself, we tend to be a little bit undersized and less physically capable against larger opponents. Firearms, again, whether it's a woman, whether it's anybody, whether it's a man, someone who is suffering from some sort of physical handicap, it greatly increases their ability to defend themselves, and a lot of times to do so at a distance, and often without even having to fire that gun. Just the mere threat of it is enough to deter and to back people off. But it's capable of being used for when that is not sufficient.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about, and the whole context of this hearing was talking about the economic impact of violence. And obviously, we need to address the gun violence issue, but I think a lot of that allows people to have weapons for their self-defense, make sure that we support the police in their role in helping protect our communities, protecting our country. So I appreciate your time, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Estes, thank you very much. I want to point out, by the way, that open borders is a Republican slogan, not a Democratic one. So I want to thank all of you for joining me in this important conversation about the staggering economic cost that gun violence imposes on our nation, and for pointing out that it is complex. While the total losses caused by gun violence are incalculable, the economic cost of gun violence cascades through our economy in real and measurable ways. We all agreed on that. As we've heard today, no one is left unaffected by this epidemic. While Americans feel the pain of these losses, gun manufacturers exploit fear and prejudice to capitalize on these tragedies, earning record profits at the expense of human lives. Congress has recently taken an important step towards gun reform, but this alone is not nearly enough. There's much more work to be done so that it keep Americans safe from gun violence and its economic toll. Thanks to each of our panelists for their contribution to this critical and ongoing discussion. As you do this important work, we rely on your expertise. And thank you as well to my colleagues for being part of this discussion and sharing your wisdom. The record will remain open for 3 business days. This hearing is adjourned.